I'd like to welcome our panel to the stage. So my very old friend, Margaret Hartnett, who wrote into the report for us, Margaret is an unusual beast.
Interesting way of putting it.
Margaret is somebody who has an engineering background, I obviously don't have, and is a patent attorney and has worked as a general counsel in an organization. So she's got a very hybrid set of skills. Ben Brooks is the head of policy at Stability AI. I've mentioned Stability to you already this morning, and they're actually using a QR code in their Stable Diffusion tool in the back of the DX room to create stickers. If you haven't had a chance to create a sticker, you should go and get it. And Umesh Rajani, who is founder of Ace on Data, and Umesh and I met on Friday. And Bart, is Bart in the room? Bart Farrell? There he is. So Bart, who's at the back, arranged something called a Twitter space. I'm not very good at all this stuff. And he arranged a Twitter space, a YouTube space, and a LinkedIn space for us on Friday. And Umesh was on a run and decided to join the conversation. And it turned out that Umesh had been at the AI Summit, that he's based in the UK, and that he runs an AI company that's open. So he was the perfect third person for our panel, and I stalked him on X, as it's now called, over the weekend to bring him into the panel. So I think you have a superb panel today, and I'm going to ask them to very quickly, 30 seconds, just introduce yourself, starting with you, Ben, as to what you would actually say about yourself rather than that intro.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. Ben Brooks, as Amanda says, lead public policy and advocacy for Stability AI. By some estimates, 80% of all AI-generated imagery is produced with our open image models. We produce video models, language models, audio models. And all of that is to preface this point, which is that we are a proudly British company headquartered above a chicken shop in Notting Hill. We're proud of that status. We're doing big things globally. We have a very large distributed team. My background is regulatory advocacy in complex and high-stakes permission-based domains, fintech, ride-sharing, drone delivery, driverless cars. And really a lot of what I do day to day is making sure that as we regulate AI, we're doing so in a way that promotes diversity in the ecosystem. It's not open versus closed. It's not just closed. It's open and closed. And we're working hard to make sure that authorities here and in the US, the EU, Singapore, and elsewhere understand the importance and the value of that diversity.
And you also facilitated our report cover last week, so we used Stable Diffusion to do that. Margaret, quick intro.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, as Amanda said, yes, I've got an interesting background. I was working in AI since my PhD in the 1990s, where we were developing three-layer feedforward networks, training them with backprop, coding them into C. Since then, I went on, did a couple of postdocs, and oh God, anyway, I've been in academia for ages. What is it? I retrained and became a patent attorney. Feel free to hiss and boo if you want. And I represented most of the largest tech companies in the world in that role. Was headhunted by a university, became head of research services for a university, was then headhunted by a tech startup, became essentially head of legal for them, dealt with every kind of stuff that you get in a tech startup, everything from immigration law to intellectual property law. Became head of research when we sold the company to a PLC, moved on, set up my own IP consultancy. Oh God, it goes on.
So lots, Margaret.
Yeah.
Lots.
Lots and lots.
Okay.
And currently I'm a co-founder of a company called Progressio, and together with my co-founders, we all have experience of bringing AI directly from research into large-scale deployments, and we're trying to bring that experience to help other companies comply with their obligations under the EU AI Act. So we're developing
Margaret.
automated technology in that.
Thank you. And Umesh, I know that you were also, like Ben, at the AI Risk Summit, as I've already mentioned. Tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so Umesh Rajani, basically from India, but I've been in Europe for almost 25, 30 years now, almost. And I was working in investment banking at the start of my career and then switched to management consulting. and also had machine learning interests for last 15 years, employing big data in most of the projects that I was doing, and got introduced to NLP 6 years ago, and then GPT-2 came, 3 came, and I had a poster on my desk which said the day there were certain questions that a model is able to answer in natural language, I'll quit my job. And came 30th of November 2022, spent 3 days without sleeping, chatting with ChatGPT, and on 5th of December, resigned and started my own company called Ace on Data. We are currently deploying open source models and closed source APIs in enterprise solutions, very large enterprise solutions, and also doing research in the field of making LLMs temporally aware, and also working on ingesting audio data directly into LLMs so that you can have TTS, ST inference directly from the LLMs.
So coming to you first, Ben, openness, what does that mean to you? And why do you think it's important in the context of AI?
Look, so I think there is a rich and very important debate underway around what exactly open source means from a licensing perspective. I think from a regulatory perspective, the conversation is a little broader. The conversation is really about AI models where the weights are publicly available, or in US nomenclature, widely available models. So these are models that you can use, you can modify, you can optimize them, and then you can redistribute those models as part of a fine-tuned model or integrated into an application. From my perspective, it is really important, as I say, that when we think about the future regulation, the future of oversight in AI, we have an eye to preserving and promoting openness. I think it's important for a few reasons. One is transparency. I mean, fundamentally, if we're going to have, if AI is going to be critical infrastructure, if people are going to be integrating models in all sorts of applications across the economy, it's important that we can inspect those models before we deploy them. And if we identify vulnerabilities, identify biases, it's important that we can then refine and optimize those models before releasing them out into the world. You can't do that if the model is gatekept, if it's behind a paywall, and if you aren't able to modify those weights yourselves through fine-tuning, reinforcement learning, DPO, or what have you. I think the second reason is competition. We have lived for the past 20, 25 years through a digital economy that has, a cluster of large platforms that run search, run social media, run payment rails. And I think we want to avoid that in the future digital economy. We want a world where developers and researchers can access models without having to spend tens of millions of pounds on the privilege, without having to reinvent the wheel and build the model from scratch. And open models provide that kind of fundamental building block. I think the other piece that doesn't get a lot of airtime is security. Especially in the US, in Washington, I think people forget that Linux is on nuclear submarines, it's in SpaceX rockets, that Android powers a majority of the world's smartphones. And one of the reasons for that, preaching to the choir here, but is that you can inspect these systems for security vulnerabilities, you can patch those vulnerabilities, you can build your own tech stack, and then at the end of that process, you own the tech stack. You're not dependent on an API for critical infrastructure. And so I think we're really trying to remind policymakers that the same patterns, the same trends play out in AI, and will continue to do so. And so many other reasons besides, but those I think are kind of the big three for us.
I'm going to come to Umesh next, because he looks like he's absolutely ready to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I draw the analogy of OpenAI, so to say, and not OpenAI as the name of the company, but truly OpenAI, with electricity and transportation. We wouldn't have been here as a society if we had those kinds of controls introduced to electricity and transportation. We reached here because we had the guardrails within which we could operate freely, and that's why we are here as a society. And in my view, this technology has the same potential. As we move forward, if you really look at just taking an example, If you look at the number of models that have come up on Hugging Face, which is kind of GitHub of models that those who don't know, you will see that there is a huge amount of grassroots innovation that is taking place in terms of the ways in which you can fine-tune the models, make them usable for every different kinds of use case. And just like, again, with electricity and transportation, this technology it has the potential to improve kind of every part of human life and beyond. And that means that you need much higher level of engagement from people to come out with their ideas and empower them to leverage this technology. And it will not be possible, and I'll give you a real example that happened in the month of March, where we implemented a solution for one of the financial institutions in Europe. And the entire pipeline was based on one of the closed source models. And overnight, they changed some of the guardrails without actually informing either the financial institution or us. And from the very next moment, the entire solution was broken because you're relying on LLM as a core service to build the rest of the solution. And when there is a mission critical implementation in large organizations, you can imagine the kind of impact it will have. And this wouldn't have happened if it was an on-prem or on-premise solution, which was specifically tailored to that institution's needs, with all the same guardrails that needs to be there for the safe operation of the technology was built within that solution. So this is one of the biggest challenges that we are currently facing as a solution provider, but also in terms of the innovation that we can bring in on the table as far as training the models or even building the inference pipelines. So some of the GitHub repos that right now, if you see trending, you will see that those repos are based on innovative solutions that you can build using open source models. And this entire ecosystem, which is currently being in a very fledgling state, but growing really, really fast and coming up with innovations that wouldn't have happened in a standard corporate environment. So that's why this particular part is extremely important as we move forward as humanity, not just as an opportunity or commercial opportunity, but as a humanity.
It's interesting you mentioned March, because March is also when the first Llama model was leaked. And I say leaked, it wasn't licensed open source, it was licensed for researchers, and those who used it were using a leaked model, not on an open source license. But by May, we see that infamous Google memo. And again, the disclaimer is that it was written by one individual. We don't actually know if the validity of the comments in it were. But there was that line, "We have no moat." And they could not compete with the open source community at scale, evolving the technology.
Absolutely, absolutely. And things have changed really, really fast. And if you really look at the number of papers itself, the research that is published on arXiv, I understand, there'll be some people who will, not agree with me, but let's say, even if you consider that 60-70% of things published on arXiv is not high quality, but you still have 20 to 30% of those papers that come out with some really, really great solutions that wouldn't have happened if it was not for models like Llama 2, or for that matter, even Mistral. We have access to open weights, and that means that we can literally do any kind of optimization, whether you talk about DPO or quantization. That is now a solution that allows you to run these models on your machine, and if you are able to fine-tune it properly, then it can actually become so powerful tool. For example, personally, in our small organization, we don't use any of the GitHub Copilot or anything. Not that I'm against it, it's just that the libraries that we use, we wanted model to be really, really powerful on those libraries. And once we fine-tuned, we had 95 to 98% accuracy on the code that was generated by those models. So that's the power of open source, basically.
So to wrap up this question, openness and why it's important, Margaret, what are your thoughts?
They're complicated. It's the simplest way of putting it. It's almost a typical lawyerly answer, it depends. I have very blended views, and I think anybody who works with IP does. Yes, I would be the first person to acknowledge the huge contributions that open source has made since its inception in every forms of software, and more notably in connection with AI development in recent years. But I also believe that people should have the right to protect the investment that they've made, the significant financial investment that they've made in the research. And we can't deny that development of large-scale models is an expensive process. Also, as a patent attorney myself, I'm coming from a slightly different perspective as well. I don't know if many of you know, but back from its history of patenting, actually there's a social contract within a patent. That is, that an invention has to be disclosed in sufficient detail to enable a person to understand the invention and potentially be able to reproduce it or build on it, that idea, albeit that they're constrained commercially by the terms of the claims at the back of the license, which is the exclusive rights and the monopoly rights. So there's always been built into the patent system the idea that society should be able to benefit from the teachings and the learnings of those people who created that research in itself. So as Ben was saying, I believe that there's ground for both, actually open and closed. I also think question what openness actually means. Is it open about the source code, or is it open about the underpinning data, which is used to train, test, cross-validate? Is it open about describing in a meaningful way how does the algorithm work? And by that, I don't mean explainability in terms of what is the basis under which the decision was made. I mean, that's a very different beastie. But how does the algorithm fundamentally work? And that's actually what you find inside of a patent application. Also, I'm finding it a bit disturbing, the more recent discussions where a concept of closed has been used, conflating the economic benefits of closeness with the safety aspects of closeness. Mm-hmm. In effect, closeness traditionally was never used to, or safety was never used to justify closed IP. It was there for the economic basis. So if we're saying that close is used to protect society, does that mean we're abrogating responsibility for protecting society to those large tech companies who are maintaining or obtaining the best economic advantage from it, because as society, we either are choosing not to take on that role ourselves, or we don't have the skill set to do that? That's a different argument in connection with openness. So that's why I see it as a very nuanced thing.
It's interesting. I suppose in many ways that goes back to who's responsible for security and ethical decisions. And as an open source lawyer, my view on that is that open source is about free flow, and we don't make those judgments. Those judgments are made by governments and regulators, and we comply with those laws. I think you have some very interesting points there. So I want to shift, and I want to talk about what's been happening. And I think I'm going to go to the US first. So Ben, you tell us a bit about what's been happening in that landscape.
Yeah, maybe to sort of preface these comments, I think what we've observed across nearly every major jurisdiction is that, if you rewind a year and a half, 2 years, the conversation around AI regulation was really around automated decision-making, algorithmic transparency on social media, and the trolley problem with driverless cars. It was fundamentally about applications of AI in particular contexts. What's happened since ChatGPT in particular is that there's been a lot of interest among policymakers in reaching back through the supply chain to regulate more fundamental kinds of research and development. We do that in certain areas. There are certain activities, there are certain domains where regulators are very comfortable reaching back. Pharmaceuticals, zero-day exploits, nuclear research. I think it's challenging in this context because you very quickly start to stifle and chill open source development and grassroots innovation in 2 or 3 ways. One is that government treats the fine-tuning of models and the release of those fine-tuned models on GitHub or Hugging Face the same as if you were releasing the model for the first time. That's been a recurring theme, particularly in places like the EU, which Margaret will talk to. We've also seen instances where policymakers have been very keen to introduce pre-market restrictions or pre-market controls on the kinds of models that you're allowed to release. And so in other words, you would have to go to a government agency and get approval before you can put something out there into the world on GitHub or Hugging Face. And I think the third area that can be very challenging for the open source community is where someone who is playing around fine-tuning models is held responsible, is held liable for what a downstream developer chooses to do with that model. Do they turn it into an unreliable chatbot? Do they turn it into a toxic chatbot? And so this has been a recurring theme in the US, where there are about 100, 120 bills in Congress that deal in some way with AI and touch on generative AI. Some of these bills are concerned with very specific kinds of misuse and specific kinds of misconduct. So, if you're producing deep fakes that are abusive or commercial or fraudulent or designed to throw an election, there's very targeted legislative proposals addressing those, and that makes a lot of sense. At the other end of the spectrum, there have been proposals to, as I say, introduce licensing and permits for models, establish a new kind of agency, and require not just Meta and Stability AI and OpenAI and others to go and get approval, but require Joe and Jane Citizen playing around on GitHub to go and get approval as well before they can share those models out with the wider community. And that's very problematic. In the middle ground is where the US executive order has landed. And that was the longest executive order in US history. There is a lot in there. But the two areas that are of greatest interest to us, and I think to the open community, are sort of twofold. One is this new kind of threshold test. Models above this threshold, defined for now as models with 10 to the 26 flops of compute used in training. Models above that threshold will have to comply with new notification and reporting requirements. And the second thing that's interesting is the launch in the next week or two of a consultation on widely available models. And this will be, to our knowledge, really the first structured conversation globally around what open models mean from a regulatory perspective. And so that's going to be a very important consultation, and I'd urge everyone to sort of stay involved in that process and make submissions and make it known what you're doing with this technology and why it's important. The administration wants to hear, the NTIA wants to hear that feedback. So I think all of which is to say there is a lot happening in the US. A lot of it will have, if it were to pass, a lot of it would have very significant indirect effects on open innovation. And so it's really important to understand how these very specific, often very technical, and in many cases very obscure legislative proposals will affect the downstream developer community.
And that consultation, which we've been waiting for, is something that OpenUK will respond to. We have responded to other US consultations previously. And if any of you feel that you want to have a voice in that, there is a universal OpenUK contact admin@openuk.uk, but let us know that you want to engage and be part of the discussion around that. So I have a hard stop in 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, but I want to get through the rest of this question with Margaret and Umesh. So Margaret, we need to keep it short, but can we talk about what happened with the EU on Friday?
Bloody hell, the EU.
Margaret, you can't say that on my stage.
I'm sorry, really, that's the only way of describing it. My God, there's been so much happening with the EU so quickly.
Only the AI Act.
Only with, well, yeah, with the AI Act. But then we've also got the AI liability bill as well, come out as well. Yeah. But with the AI Act, my God, it's been an absolute race. Because really what's happening here is they're trying to get this regulation, it's called the Act, but it's a regulation, formally. They're trying to get the regulation adopted and agreed by the EU before the next European parliamentary elections, which are going to be this summer. And trying to get through the entire process of what we call trilogue negotiations has been fraught. And there were marathon negotiations in December to mid-December. Then I think it was just Friday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was the permanent members have agreed the text, which was formally agreed.
So that text was seen on Friday for the first time.
Pardon me?
The text was seen for the first time on Friday.
Well,
Publicly.
Publicly, yeah.
December,
Yeah.
they had
Remember,
about a
we've
month
got
to review.
1 minute to finish the EU and 1 minute to do the UK. So what did we see on Friday?
so yeah, there was formally the results from the trilogue negotiations were made available, publicly available on Friday. There will now be another negotiation, rubber stamping by the two committees of the European Parliament who negotiated, and then there'll be a plenary session. That's the entire European Parliament. We will agree the text, and I think it's the middle of April.
And
But
from an open source perspective?
So open source is interesting because there's an exemption within the EU AI Act as refers to FOSS, but it's not
So
straightforward.
it refers to free and open source software.
Specifically in relation to open source software. That's the problem, isn't it? Because they don't define what open source is. That's a bloody horrible one. But beyond that, there's even exemptions from the exemption.
Yeah.
So it's not like all open source AI is exempted from the Act. So, for example, prohibited systems. Well, it makes sense. A really, truly horrible system should be banned from the EU, regardless whether it's under a closed license or an open license. Sure. GPAI. Okay, it's not. They say that Tier 1 is exempted, but when you look at it, you still have to do the transparency. To me, that's not an exemption. You still have to do it if you're Tier 2. And then there's a really big one about whether it's put on the market and what constitutes being put on the market. The problem here is that you've also got really, dare I say it, clunky drafting. That is where the provisions sometimes don't particularly well match with the recitals. That's a bit at the front of the Act, which you use to interpret the Act. Well, actually, it doesn't help with interpreting because it kind of conflicts with it. So, yeah, horrible.
I'm sorry to wrap this up, but if you look at the Cyber Resilience Act, we see a definition of free and open source software, which is not one I've ever seen before. It's not one the Commission has used before. It does not represent the four freedoms, and it does not represent the open source definition. So we have a new definition there with a second sentence that talks about being developed in the open, and we don't know if that's part of the definition yet or not. And I understand the conversation with the Commission last week included a suggestion that the open source community go off and create a standard that defines open source. So who knows where that's all going to go. Umesh, 30 seconds. What's happening in the UK before I get the Baroness on stage?
Yeah, so UK, from my point of view, is kind of a dichotomy. What we had the AI Safety Summit, which was highly focused on the safety aspects, and then you have the Lords coming out with the House of Lords coming out with this report on LLMs, where they have, I was very happy to read that report by and large, so to say, is that they have acknowledged how we are left behind actually in this entire race. And personally, like as a country that I now call my home, I wouldn't like this country to not have a single foundational model, and that's what is being acknowledged in that particular thing. And just it connects to also to the EU AI Act. One of the disturbing part, where they have considered the sensitive areas of application, is the education and vocational applications, which is highly restrictive. Like it literally, I was in Paris yesterday in Station F, and almost 11 startups are on a standby because of the mention of education and vocational. So that's where I think the application, because there'll be a very close coordination between UK and EU Act being first past the post, it will have a major impact on how UK will frame the policy. And if we adopt all that, then we are heading into kind of a very disturbing territory.
And there's many ways that I am going to disagree on this and say that I think it's a good thing that we have this late mover advantage and we're seeing what other people are doing first. The OECD put a new definition of AI out in December, but we don't have that for open source, so it's obviously a worry to all of us how it's going to be defined. So I am rushing because I want to make sure the Baroness has her opportunity to speak and she has a hard stop. So if you would join with me in thanking this absolutely fantastic panel.